Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture of literature. I am Adrian Ford, and we are here for a party. A celebration of sorts. You're going to have some fun, aren't you? We're going to celebrate like all the coolest people celebrate with, of course, poetry. Now, the first thing I want to do is say, hey, this is the 100th poetry discussion on the channel here. And I want to thank you for being here, not in the sort of touchy-feely, YouTube-y way of, thanks for watching all my videos. No, that's not how I mean it. What I mean is, no one watches poetry videos. Nobody at all watches poetry videos, except for you. One of very few. I have made... Now, because no one watches poetry videos, my channel gets absolutely destroyed in what you've heard called the YouTube algorithm. I don't care. I don't care. Part of my mission here is to spread literature, to make poetry more accessible, to make literature itself more accessible. In my estimation, the absolute fundamental building block of literature is poetry, because little bite-sized thing through which you can sort of understand all of literature and start to decode everything that happens therein. So I want to thank you for being here, because being absolutely destroyed in the YouTube algorithm every time I make one of these videos, and having deigned to create 100 now of them, the fact that you're here for this being the 100th video in the poetry discussion list means something to me. It really does. I have worked for 5 years now on this thing called Strip Cover Lit. And back to the very beginning, back to the point where this was an idea. Part of that idea was simply that I think more literature in the world is a good thing for the world. So thank you for being here. Now, I have further, from this point, no plan really for this video, except that I have a handful, a score of poems picked, a fortnight of poems picked out here. And I just want to talk about them maybe in a little bit of a different way than I normally do. So normally what I'm doing is talking about one thing behind a poem, or talking about the symbolism or the themes or such and such and such and such. It's not really what I want to do today. But undoubtedly, I'm going to slip into that because of this is what I like to do with literature. That's my favorite thing here. But part of it is I want to talk a little bit about what the poem means to me. So I don't really do that a lot, because how boring is that, I think? Why put my feelings about something out there versus just the thing and what's in it, right? I think that is ultimately what is more accessible and infinitely more interesting with literature, is talking about the ideas. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that too. But so I'm going to start here in literature. So by the way, 100 videos now in this playlist. If you haven't been here for all of them, consider taking a gander at them to see if your favorite poem is there, because probably it is not. Probably it's not, unless it was written by Charles Bukowski or Emily Dickinson. But there's a lot of poems that aren't written by either of those two characters from literature in this playlist. Now, the first poem I want to start with here is I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud by William Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. They stretched in never-ending line along the margin of the bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. So for me, this poem is one that sort of slapped me in the face. Where is it here? Vacant or pensive mood is something that has always been a part of my life. So when I found this poem, like at first, the first time I read this poem, it was just a bunch of words to me. I'm going to be honest. But once I digested the poem, it was the feeling, the whole new age sort of Twitter phrase, I feel seen, I feel recognized, I feel called out even, in those, in the memes that are often presented online. That's how I was with this poem. And look, hey, that's how you should feel with a poem. Probably if you gave any poem from any writer in any culture, if you gave it its proper due, you would realize that you feel recognized by that poem. There's a little bit of you in every poem. There is not the drop. You are not the drop in the ocean. You are the ocean in every drop, right? So that is how literature works, is that you're in every poem and every poem is in you, if you're willing to do the work and figure it out. For me, this poem took a while for me to figure that out. But once I did, I was a relative novice with literature in general. Still a relative novice with literature in general, especially you read someone like Harold Bloom, you read someone like Christopher Hitchens, you realize, oh, I don't really know shit. So this was, when I read this poem, no idea who William Wordsworth was at that time. No real idea. I recognized the name. I'm sure I had probably read this poem before. I'm sure that there are others that I had read before. I was an undergraduate. I had just... So that's where this book is from. This book here is from my undergraduate days. So there's going to be a story connected with that, with, I believe, all three of the poems that I am presenting in this collection. I also have Bukowski and Langston Hughes and, of course, Emily Dickinson to go yet. But this poem, once I decoded that, and I said, oh, yeah, that's me, I realized William Wordsworth lived from 1770 to 1850. 1770 to 1850, and there is this poem about depression, essentially, that's in which I recognize myself. And I mean, listen to those dates. William Wordsworth lived from 1770 to 1850. He would have been among the first native-born citizens of the United States, if that's where he lived. Did not. You see what I'm saying, though? When you think of, I don't know, in historical terms, it could have been George Washington's son, okay? That's how far back we're going. To make that realization for me at the time when I made it was sort of a slap in the face. One of the greatest I think, realizations in literature is that one of the greatest but simultaneously most defeating realizations that you can make through literature is that, hey, you're not special. You're unique. You're you. You're the only you that's ever existed. The most wonderful thing about Tigger is he's the only one. But everything you feel has been felt before. Really, there's only a handful of emotions, right? And every weird emotion that we can have is just a mixture of two of them. What two, depends. But you put two of them together, and that becomes what comes out in literature. There is all too saccharine a sort of. So if we go back in this collection, there's 200 poems in here. We go back to the early ones. Where is it here? I know it's in here, but okay, maybe it's not. My love is a red, red rose, right? That poem. My love is a red, red rose. On the surface level, very saccharine, very one emotion. Literature that we feel to be novel, literature that we feel to be groundbreaking. And when I say literature, movies, right? Movies that give you that feeling of novel, that feeling of new, that feeling of authenticity. Music that gives you the same feeling. This is authentic, this is new, this is different. It's just, almost always, it's blending two things that you had never felt blended together, that you have never recognized blended together, because you felt it. You felt those things. You've just never recognized them in something. Oftentimes, this is what happens with genre as well. Things that strike us as novel. Things that strike us as novel and new. A lot of times what they're doing is they're taking two different things and mixing them together. My favorite example probably is the movie Logan. It's a comic book superhero movie. You've seen 1,000 of them. It is a Western. Down to the point that at the end of the movie, and not a spoiler really, but at the end of the movie, they're driving off into the desert in a Bronco, right? It's a comic book superhero movie, and it's a Western. You mix them together, you get something that feels real new. Most often, what we're talking about with literature, what we're talking about with poetry, that gives us that sort of authentic feeling is mixing two emotions together. You pick the two emotions, you mix them together, and it feels real new. Here we have that vacant, pensive mood mixed with the dancing of the daffodils. So that is, to our speaker here, the daffodils are jocund and gay, which I would argue in the context of the poem feels more inspirational, meaning feels like something more that would invoke action versus simple joy. So this poem that feels the way it does, feels sort of out there, feels more authentic, feels different, is mixing motivation with depression. And if you've been in that place, it triggers in you, just like a memory of childhood. If I were to hear the opening theme to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, it would put me back at being 5 years old. And to trigger this emotion of motivation mixed with depression puts anyone who's been in that place, most of you have been in that place, right? Everybody's been in that place. It elicits from you a response, and the response that it elicits is the feeling you had when you became motivated from a place of depression, where you are depressed and you realize, I gotta live, baby. Every one of those trips that I was depressed, I gotta live, baby. Every one of those trips, boom, boom, is in itself novel. Every one of them. Because there's something new there that you're grasping onto to climb out of where you had been. So that's what I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud means to me. The next one I want to talk about here is My Papa's Waltz. So while and whereas I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud would have been assigned to me as an undergraduate, the next two poems in this collection would not have been. They would have been something from this collection that I had stumbled on my own. My Papa's Waltz very much being one of those poems, which was brought back to me by my good friend Ian in my master's program. So My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Rothke. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. Every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. Is this poem about dancing with Dad in the living room as a child? Or is it about surviving abuse? It could be both things at once. Both things here seem to be roiling beneath the surface. If you read it as the emotions which are painted by the words naked and on the surface, this poem could very easily still be sentimental. Not just, a mirthful memory. But if Father has passed, a memory of something we will not have again. And when thinking about that, think about how quickly memories are gone. Think about how quickly, upon someone's absence, you start to forget things about them. Maybe it's the sound of their voice. This poem was published in 1948. Not a whole lot of recordings at that time, right? Wouldn't have been a ton of photographic memories of people. Not like there are today, for sure. Think about how quickly those things escape you. Think about how one day you will wake up and even some of your most cherished memories with someone, your father, for example, will be gone. Never to return. Never to return. Will be as if they never existed. So here, this poem, if taken at surface value, is an attempt to encapsulate one of those memories never to be destroyed, never to be let go. It's an attempt at it. However, if you read it a little bit under the surface, something that I think is definitely there, however, is the undertone of abuse. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy. Well, not a whole lot of Hallmark cards that start with that phrase. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. How much dancing gets that violent? Gets that heavy trodden upon the floor? My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. Strange detail for a happy memory. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. Battered from what? Battered itself, a strange choice of words. You beat time on my head with a poem caked hard by dirt. Now, pop, if I'm trying to get you to keep along, that's one thing. But to beat time on someone's head, beat. You did not keep time on my head. You did not tap time on my head. You beat it. Another strange choice of words. Then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. Clinging. So this poem for me was a very strong lesson in saying the opposite of what you mean, painting the opposite picture of what you mean. And I think on a critical level, so for the writer, that's an obvious, huge thing to learn, right? For a writer, that's an obvious, huge lesson. But as a critic, this is something that I think is invaluable. Because if you can have in this poem the image of dancing with daddy and the message of I survived abuse as a child, you can have both of those things present. Look at the chasm between those. All of those things are there. As a critic, if you present me with this, but I see this going on, I can make almost any case in between. Almost any case in between. Being able to make almost any case in between, what happens is that the available interpretation for the work is innumerable. That available interpretation for the work being innumerable means that the personal emotional connection for that piece will be there no matter who the reader is. No matter who the reader is. No matter who the reader is, there will be some type of connection for that person to take from this poem. The next poem is special to me. It is Charles Bukowski, but I don't believe it's in any of the Bukowski collections that I have. It is titled My Old Man. Charles Bukowski, My Old Man. 16 years old, during the Depression, I'd come home drunk in all my clothing. Shorts, shirts, stockings, suitcase, and pages of short stories would be thrown out on the front lawn about the street. My mother would be waiting behind a tree. Henry, don't go in. He'll kill you. He's read your short stories. I can whip his ass. Henry, please, take this and find yourself a room. But it worried him that I might not finish high school, so I'd be back again. One evening he walked in with the pages of one of my short stories, which I had never submitted to him, and he said, "This is a great short story." I said, "Okay." And he handed it to me, and I read it. It was a story about a rich man who had a fight with his wife and had gone out into the night for a cup of coffee and had observed the waitress and the spoons and the forks and the salt and pepper shakers and the neon sign in the window, and then had gone back to his stable to see and touch his favorite horse, who then kicked him in the head and killed him. Somehow, the story held meaning for him, though when I had written it, I had no idea of what I was writing about. So I told him, "Okay, old man, you can have it." And he took it and walked out and closed the door. I guess that's as close as we ever got. For me, this short story was almost as formative in its mystery as it was in its practice. I read this short story not on schedule, not out of assignment, but one day in class, while the class was talking about something I was supposed to have read and written and didn't, I just started leafing through the pages. Now, to this point, I had heard of Charles Bukowski, but I had never read Charles Bukowski. Just as I had heard of, I don't know, W.H. Auden, but never read him. Just as I had heard of Gertrude Stein, but never read her. Just as I had heard of, oh, come on, give me a name. Tennyson, but never read Tennyson. At this point in my life, as an undergraduate, even though I was older for an undergraduate, I had never read Bukowski. So the name Bukowski didn't really mean anything to me. But I read this poem and it stuck with me. It stuck with me and stuck with me. It reminds me of personal stuff. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. But it stuck with me so long that I had to try to find it again. And for weeks, I was sort of ambling from class. I couldn't remember what book it was in. I couldn't remember what class it was from. I couldn't remember who the author was. I just remembered the poem. And I needed to find that poem. And I thought I had construed in my brain, because everyone who is a literature major will remember this from their schooling days. When you're a lit major, there's no way you have time to read everything that you're supposed to read. So there's almost 0% chance that you read anything that you were not supposed to read. So in my mind, I had construed it as something that I had read for class. So I needed it. I needed this poem. And I would go from class to class, striking up conversation with classmates, which was very strange because none of them, I talked to none of them. I was not sociable. I was not domesticated as a student. And I would, hey, do you remember that poem we read? The one about hiding behind a tree and an abusive father and a horse kills him? What? No, I don't. We didn't read that. Yeah, no, I can't remember which class it was. So I'm getting, it wasn't this one. It wasn't this class. No, it was not. This is a novel class. This is a class about novels. Oh, right. So I'd go to the next class and I'd pick somebody out. Someone that I knew was doing the reading. Hey, you remember that poem we read about a woman in a tree and a horse that kills a guy? You remember that? You remember that at all? Nope, don't remember that. I have no idea what you're talking about. For weeks, I did this. And during that time, no one knew what I was talking about. And I would just keep reading poems in different books that I had, because as a literature major, I had 20 books that I was supposed to read. You know, every quarter, every semester, there's so many books you're supposed to read. And finally, I found it. But I only refound it after having found Bukowski. I found, I don't know what other poems they were by Bukowski, but I had stumbled across some other Bukowski off schedule reading. And I was like, hey, this guy's voice sounds a lot like that poem I'm missing. So I found this book, went back to, oh yeah, there's a Bukowski in here. Let me go read it. Now, the poem itself, the poem in question, My Old Man. The thing that sticks out the most to me among the stuff that is not directly mentioned, so you've got the relationship between the speaker and his father, you've got the relationship between the father and literature, you've got the relationship between the speaker and literature. But the thing that sticks out to me, that I think is worth mentioning here, mother hiding behind the tree. So, I mean, obviously, mother's not in a great place with father, right? Obviously, mother is hiding behind the tree for a reason. But one thing that we have to read into this poem is the fact that our speaker is some type of perverse mirror image of the father. Both literature, both rough kind of guys, which leaves mother standing behind the tree. The mother image in this poem is isolated, and it's isolated in nature. Isolated with a tree. Person, tree, house test. Google that if you have not. But here we have the mother being isolated between these two individuals that obviously hold a massive place in her world. And how quickly. So, the poem's titled My Old Man. The next person we have is my mother. And then we get back to the father figure. So the mother is sandwiched between invocations of the father. Which is really being sandwiched or being the peacekeeper between the speaker and the father. Trying to create distance between the two. Whether you want to, so starts My Old Man. Then it goes into 16 years old during the Depression. My old man, 16 years old during the Depression. There's space there visually. There's no space there when you're reading it. So that first one, the perverse mirror image of the old man becomes the original speaker, 16 years old during the Depression. Anyway, moving on. Langston Hughes. Let's get some Langston Hughes into this party. This is a party. You're having fun, aren't you? Fun talking about poetry? You've been here for over half an hour, you'd better be. Harlem. Technically, Harlem 2, as far as this compilation is concerned. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore, and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust over, or crust and sugar over, like a syrupy sweet. Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? Here again we have. So, I wandered lonely as a cloud. You had the inspiration mixed with depression. Theodore Rothke, you had My Papa's Waltz, or Papa's Waltz. Is it Papa's Waltz or either way, you have a story of love or a story of abuse. With My Old Man, you have the story of rivalry with the old man versus the end, where the old man falls in love with a piece of literature that the son had written. And you have, so remember, talked about the mixing of the emotions there. What are we doing? We're creating something novel from taking the primary colors of emotion, happiness and love and sadness and all these basic emotions, and rubbing them together until we create something novel. What happens to a dream deferred? My whole life, when I was a kid, really the idea of going to college as a status symbol, as a mark of making it, was emerging. Or maybe it was self-emergent long before, but it was something that was becoming obvious to me. I think in the television of the late 80s, early 90s, the idea that, oh, that person has a college degree became preeminent. And the smart ones were always the successful ones. The smart characters made it. I had always wanted to go to college. Always wanted to go to college. As part of that pursuit, I started playing organized sports, thinking, early on, middle school, like, everyone thinks that they're going to be a professional, whatever it is that they're doing. Being short and slow and not particularly athletically inclined, that dream dies quickly. But the idea that there are millions of scholarships available every year. Hey, I could be a fullback at a NAIA school maybe, right? I got that type of skill. Eventually, even that died. But the idea, the dream of going to college still persisted for me. It became the dream of going to community college as reality set in further and further. Which anyone who's gone to community college understands is just a time and money suck. It's just like a drain for all of your time and all of your money. You get nothing out of it. You get nothing out of it. And you get nothing out of it. Not experience, not real learning, not a useful degree, nothing. Which became, after getting that associate's degree, the dream of going to a university. So eventually, 23, 24 years old, I make that leap. And I get to university and realize, first, I was going to be a high school English teacher. The program at Missouri Western for being a teacher was awful. Just malignant. The idea sprouts in your brain that maybe this isn't all that it's cracked up to be, and it just grows, just explodes. Okay? my education professor. Very sanctimonious man. Who just prided, I mean, when you think hippie education instructor, this was the guy. This was the guy. And one of the things that he liked to do was put us all in groups. You're not teaching as a group, right? So first thing that set me off with this program, I was set into a kindergarten classroom. I want to be a high school English teacher, and the first thing they do is they put me for 6 weeks in a kindergarten classroom. Me with 5-year-olds was a disaster. What was I don't understand this. I don't understand children. It was awful, miserable experience. Tried to make the best of it. And it wasn't the kids. There was a couple of kids, but it wasn't kids. But this sanctimonious professor loved to put us in groups. And I'm telling this story. You're going to have to trust me on part of it. You're going to have to understand that I'm not making fun of anyone, any of my classmates. There was a guy, so group of 3, me, another woman who was a little bit older and going back to college and figuring things out, and a guy that seemed, I don't know, he seemed some sort of special. That's the only way I can put it. Seemed some sort of special. It wasn't my business. He was in my group. Tried to help him the best I could with what he needed there. And I mean, so when I say special, I mean, I don't even know how to, like when you hear the word special in education situations, you know what I'm saying. And again, I'm not making fun of the guy. I'm not trying to put anyone down. There were things that didn't click with him. There were some things that he simply was not capable of. Okay? Still, in my group, my duty, we're making sure this goes well. Right? The temerity of my professor. Hey, Adrian, come here. We're gonna call him Chuck. Name wasn't Chuck. I don't even remember his name, to be honest. Now, Adrian, Chuck is in your group, and I need to know what Chuck is capable of. So on your presentation, I need you guys to figure out how to make it obvious to me what he's capable of. Okay. Very uncomfortable at that. So what we had to do was the next time we were going to see this professor, we were going to pitch to him our idea for our presentation. I used the intervening time to become absolutely enraged. First off, you're the one telling us. Okay, so I became absolutely enraged that what you're trying to do, A, is let my grades suffer for someone else not being capable of something. Second, what you're trying to do is allow me to allow someone else to embarrass themselves in front of a class. Further, what you're doing is putting upon me your responsibilities as a professor. So we all had to line up outside of his office and go in and pitch our idea. by the time we were the next group in, I said, hey guys, I got to go in and have a chat. I went in that office by myself and I laid into him. What are you trying to do? You're trying to do this, you're trying to do that, you're trying to do the third. That's not my job. That is your job. You want to talk about, hey, we're here to be teachers. You want me to do this for you. I'm not here as a college professor. I'm not here to sacrifice my grade on something you've assigned with people you put in the group with me, with people the university has allowed admission. Okay? If admissions let this guy in to the class, it's not my responsibility to try to weed him out. That's your job. Laid into him. Now, why am I telling you this? For me, this was all the dream deferred. This was all the dream deferred. My dream was college. My dream was to be the educated individual. My dream was words. American letters, letters in general, literature, education. So I understand when Langston Hughes asks, a dream deferred, does it become saccharine? Does it sugar over and become syrupy sweet? Or does it explode? I cannot explain to you how irritated I was with my dream of education, of college, by this point. Only to go tens of thousands of dollars further into debt by pursuing a master's degree, whereby all of my professors came from the same college. All of my professors were basically individuals who had gotten a degree from the same place and couldn't find a job elsewhere. So someone else, the administrator responsible for hiring professors, was from the same university, SLU, St. Louis University. Much more prestigious than the place from whence I got my master's degree, but it was a dumping ground. My professors were a dumping ground from that university. So, I understand what this poem is talking about. Asking the question, what happens to a dream deferred? What happens to a person's big idea when it keeps getting pushed off further into the future? Further, and you get almost there, and it gets further, and you get almost there, and it gets further away. There's a point there. So again, this duality in poetry. Does it become saccharine? Does it become syrupy sweet? Does it sugar over? Or does it explode? I understand that duality. Because I think in the outset, when I was still struggling to get my associate's degree, that 2-year introductory degree that should have been lickety-split, baby, should have had it by the time I was 20. Took me till I was 25, having to work through, having to miss semesters, having to take time off school, this and that, right? That's what happens to you in community college. During that time, that dream deferred of being the educated individual sugared over, became syrupy sweet, was saccharine. That idea, someday, I'm going to get that piece of paper, baby. Now, look behind me. Art books. Do you see a framed degree? I don't have any of my degrees in paper form. Didn't care by the time I got them. Was so displeased with the process. Look, they were worthless anyway. Getting a bachelor's in literature, worthless anyway. Getting a master's in creative writing, worthless anyway. It wasn't for that. It wasn't for the piece of paper. And by the time I got the piece of paper, I realized that the piece of paper, the degree, wasn't worth the piece of paper on which it was printed. Because the idea of the dream of pursuing the education, of pursuing the degree, started to sugar over until the dream of pursuing the degree became the dream of being the educated individual, at which time it exploded. So that's what that poem means to me. I understand the duality between the dream becoming sugary sweet and the dream exploding. That one might have gotten too real. Charles Bukowski, Pleasures of the Damned. The Loner. 16 1/2 inch neck. Now, I don't know what it is with Charles Bukowski poems beginning with the number 16. The Loner. 16 1/2 inch neck. 68 years old. Lifts weights. Body like a young boy, almost. Kept his head shaved and drank port wine from half-gallon jugs. Kept the chain on the door, windows boarded. You had to give a special knock to get in. He had brass knucks, knives, clubs, guns. He had a chest like a wrestler. Never lost his glasses, never swore, never looked for trouble. Never married after the death of his only wife. Hated cats, roaches, mice, humans, worked crossword puzzles, kept up with the news. That 16 1/2 inch neck, for 68, he was something. All those boards across the windows, washed his own underwear and socks. My friend Red took me to meet him one night. We talked while together. Then we left. Red asked, "What do you think?" I answered, "More afraid to die than the rest of us." I haven't seen either one of them since. Now, believe it or not, I've always been something of a loner. I know, hey, a channel where I have hundreds of hours of me talking about books online seems like I must be the most popular guy in the room at all times. The most outgoing guy in the room at all times. Seems that way, not that way. Counterintuitive, I know. That poem has to hit you if you're a loner. Now, so I think part of what it is with that poem that speaks to me is that Bukowski's always struck me as a bit of a loner, a writer, a recluse, a violent kind of guy, a rough fella. Then you get a poem like that and you realize, oh, well, Bukowski does have a lot of poems where he talks about other people, where there must have been other people there. Bukowski does have a lot of those. And is a loner. Always been a loner. Not something I chose. For me, that poem, the duality of that poem is in the fact that the loner presented is a guy that seems to be living the life that he chooses to the utmost. 16-inch neck really is impressive. If that's on a 70-year-old guy, real impressive. He's really doing his stuff. Keeps up with the news. Every day he's in touch with what's going on, right? all these things that he does, drinking all of his wine straight from the half-gallon jug, seems to be living the life he chooses. And Bukowski makes the observation, more afraid to die than the rest of us. You realize that must be true. That's why he's boarded himself up. That's why he has kept himself out of the rest of the world. He'll learn about the rest of the world, but keeps himself separated from it. Yeah, man. That type of protection, that type of self-preservation, there's something to that does seem to be sort of scared. Especially when you contrast it with the idea of Charles Bukowski. The idea that we have of Charles Bukowski, the Chiansky or Chinaski, I always twist this around, that Bukowski writes about. Bukowski's character really seems to be living on the edge, seems to be getting into things that other people do not. Why is that? Why is that? Where do we draw the line between a healthy fear of death and being scared to die? The healthy fear of death, no one really says much about that. And if they do, they're probably not someone you want to follow. But being afraid to die, that's a different message. That's a different thing altogether. Being afraid to die means being willing to take extreme measures in order to preserve your life, however small that life might be. One symbol that I like to use because I think this symbol is ubiquitous once we allow it, is the idea of spiral, right? Our lives sort of spiral inwards. And every once in a while, people will realize this about themselves, that I have become just this ever-increasingly small circle. This is what the midlife crisis is about. The 45-year-old guy that realizes all I do is go home to my wife after spending 8 hours at a job that I hate. I gain 10 more pounds every year. I drive the same beat-up car. Yada, 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 yada. My income's never going to grow at this point. The outgoing is going to have to stay the same. The expenses are going to have to stay the same, right? The spiral in which our loner finds himself is his whole world. It's his whole world. Following the news, drinking the port wine, working out, not having people. Not having, as Bukowski points out, cats or mice or roaches. Not having any of that other life. Just his own and the occasional visitor that has to have the special knock to get in. The thing that is special about this poem to me, as a loner, is that the loner involved does not recognize it. The loner involved in this poem does not recognize the spiral into which he has worked himself. That's terrifying. That is terrifying. Because that's how you end up waking up one day at 46 years old and realizing your entire life is the same thing over and over again, and there's no room to go anywhere else, and starting anything else would mean starting a life over again, and you don't want to have to start at root one. You don't want to have to start at square one, because starting at square one is so much more work than the amount of work you're willing to put in. And the amount of work you're willing to put in really doesn't get you past square one, and you recognize that you're on square 10 given square one type of energy. And if anybody on square 9 or 11 recognizes that, you could end up back at square one and your whole life would be over. That's a terrifying thing. Next poem here, Bluebird, The Bluebird. You know, it's weird. In this collection, it's called The Bluebird. You look it up online, lots of places it's just listed as Bluebird. So this is a poem for which I have already done a video this month. I've already done videos in the past. You're just going to have to hear about it again. The Bluebird. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay in there. I'm not going to let anybody see you. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I pour whiskey on him and inhale cigarette smoke. And the whores and the bartenders and the grocery clerks never know he's in there. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay down. Do you want to mess me up? You want to screw up the works? You want to blow my book sales in Europe? There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too clever. I only let him out at night sometimes, when everybody's asleep. I say, I know that you're in there, so don't be sad. Then I put him back, but he's singing a little in there. I haven't quite let him die. And we sleep together like that, with our secret pact. And it's nice enough to make a man weep. But I don't weep. Do you? I must have talked about that poem 1,000 times on the channel by now. I will mention that poem in the middle of other poetry reviews, so surely you know my feelings on it. It is something... That poem, in conjunction with The Loner. The Loner, in Bukowski's The Loner, let the bluebird die. That bluebird is in all of us. Even the tough guys. Some of us let it die. The Loner in The Loner let it die and didn't recognize it. Didn't recognize when his entire existence was spiraling into the same little stuff over and over and over again. Didn't recognize it. And ended up the loner. Bukowski's speaker in The Bluebird recognizes this and realizes, I don't want that spiral. I've spiraled in to a certain point. I'm right here. I'm not here. I'm not here where the loner and the loner is. Not quite there. I'm still out here. And if I can keep it there, where instead of this entire circle of naivety, this entire circle of sociability will drain your life just as fast as this little circle of nothingness will. If I can keep right around here, I can be some type of social and, well, still keep my writing. Still keep all of the creative juices flowing, still keep all of the creativity going. And so long as I can keep the creativity going, I can continue rattling around in that spiral and being the me that I need to be in order to be. So he lets the Bluebird out every once in a while and humors him. Oh, what have I here? It just happens to be Emily Dickinson. There's maybe a couple poems from Emily Dickinson I want to talk about. Now, let it be known, when picking out, I had nothing planned for this video. So I didn't realize, and when I say nothing planned, I mean not a jot or a tittle in any of the margins of these books for these discussions. So the fact that we are an hour and 6 minutes in right now, before getting to Emily Dickinson, and a couple poems from Emily, I didn't know we would be here. I didn't know we would be this far in. Maybe a few of these will go faster. I make no promises. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, an eye, and silence, some strange race wrecked solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. So if we're going from Bukowski, where the loner doesn't realize his life is spiraling, and the speaker in the Bluebird does realize his life is spiraling and tries to make some sort of railing to keep his life from spiraling further, but still a railing on the other side to keep from spiraling outward either. Here we have in Emily Dickinson a speaker who has let it all go. A speaker who is dead. Doesn't even know. So Emily Dickinson for me is, Emily Dickinson is the nuclear option. Emily Dickinson was a poet without limitation, and whose words knew not the bounds of theme. I mean, theme to Emily Dickinson is an emergent process. With Emily Dickinson, you're looking at ideas. I felt a funeral in my brain. What does that even mean? I felt a funeral in my brain. Is that feeling the sensation of dying? Doesn't seem so. With Emily Dickinson, oftentimes what we have is the real world, the tangible world, and the world of ideas refusing to interface. The two things will exist and will have a parallel economy. But there will be no connection, not mentioned by the poet. So to go back to, for example, the Bluebird. The speaker is the tough guy. You want to blow my sails in Europe? You want to screw up the works? The Bluebird is his softness. Those two things interface when Bukowski, when our speaker, I only let him out at night sometimes when everybody's asleep. That's those two worlds interfacing. The tough guy exterior pulling the Bluebird out and saying, hey, I know you're in there. We can exist together. Can't really be seen. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. Now, what we have is the idea of death and a reality of death, and sense was breaking through. But we don't ever really get sense breaking through. So feeling the funeral in the brain, you want to say, my brain senses a funeral going on. In my brain, I felt a funeral going on. I felt a funeral going on in my brain. I think both statements are being made here. I felt my body was dead. I felt my ideas were dead. And if you're willing to concede those two things happening simultaneously, read the poem again. I felt a funeral in my brain. Conceding that this might be, my brain was picking up on a funeral happening, as well as I felt my ideas dying. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service, like a drum, kept beating till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul. With those same boots of lead again, then space began to toll. As all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, an eye, and silence, some strange race, wrecked, solitary, here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. I think that poem is another poem which could be described as absolutely terrifying, if you allow it. I died for beauty, but was scarce adjusted in the tomb. When one who died for truth was lain in an adjoining room, he questioned softly why I failed. For beauty, I replied, and I, for truth, themself are one. We brethren are, he said. And so, as kinsmen met at night, we talked between the rooms until the moss had reached our lips and covered up our names. This was my first favorite poem. This might be the only favorite poem I ever have. The Bluebird is up there. This poem, every time I think about it, just takes me aback, takes me by surprise, transports me. So my story with this poem is I first read it my sophomore year in high school, a poetry section in my English class, and it struck me. And there was a mall a few miles from where I lived, and in that mall there was a bookstore. This poem helped me fall in love with poetry. Poetry was about a 9-foot section in that mall bookstore. And by the time, was it the summer before your junior year, you get your license and stuff like that, depending on your age, right? Summer before my junior year, I could drive. And I would go to that mall. By that time, the poetry section in that mall had shrunk from 9 feet, 3-foot sections, to 2 3-foot sections. But that was okay, because what I would do is I would go up there and I would visit this book. And I would find this poem. And I would just read this poem. Didn't have the money to buy the book, but I would read this poem over and over again. Just spend time with it. And then, one day, I got to the mall, and that 9-foot section of poetry, which had become a 6-foot section of poetry, was just a 3-foot section of poetry. And they still had Emily Dickinson. Somewhere along the way, I bought the book. But I kept going to that bookstore, finding different poems and different poetry collections, until one day I went in and there was no poetry section. Soon thereafter, there was no bookstore. A little thereafter, there was no mall. But I've always wondered if that slow descent of poetry is ultimately what has become the undoing of the literary world. You often pull up Twitter, search writing community or writer's lift or any of those hashtags that have to do with writing, with writers, with literature. Well, not with literature, but just with writing. And there will be on any given day, I promise you, within the first 50 tweets you read, someone asking the question, hey, if I'm going to be a writer, do I have to start with short stories, or don't you think I can just jump right into novels? It's sort of a bleating question. It's sort of a, hey, look at me question. Who cares? If you think you can do it, do it. If you don't, don't. But what happens? Look back in history. A lot of novelists began with short stories, honed their craft, and became novelists. Novels always were how a writer becomes paid. Even today, if you can get paid for being a writer, it's as a novelist. You don't make anything for short stories, you don't make anything for poetry. But if we're willing to acknowledge that short stories are the building blocks for novelists, poetry is the building block for literature. It just is. Writing it, reading it, critiquing it, understanding it, all of these things start with the idea of poetry, with the building block of poetry. Poetry's dead. Just is. Just is. Just is. I don't say that with any modicum of joy at all. At all. But I believe it to be true. I believe in part it has been killed by music. think that's understandable. Music is easier to consume. Music is used to do a lot of the same things that poetry used to do. Even down to, so in the same way that photography freed up painters from the need for verisimilitude. Go back and look at it. Once photography became more prevalent, the Picassos of the world started emerging. Things like that. Surrealism and whatnot became a practice. Music freed poetry from the need for rhyme, from the need for predictability, from the need for structure, etc., etc., etc. And I think, in the same way that, look, I'm not a big fan of postmodern art, just not. Paintings is what I'm talking about mainly right now, but sort of in general. If you ask me if I would rather go to a museum and see an exhibit of a painter from 1980 or a painter from 1780, and you don't give me names, I'm going to pick 1780. Call me a fuddy-duddy. That freedom from verisimilitude didn't unlock as much as it untethered. Picasso, okay, I can understand it, unlocked from the need for verisimilitude. Some of these other painters become untethered, in that what happened is not that they were freed, unlocked, like Picasso. They were untethered from verisimilitude and faded away from anything recognizable as real. I think a lot of that has happened with poetry as well. And I say this as someone who has tried. I have tried. I'm not saying there's no good poets out there. I'm not saying that. I'm sure that, look, I like Richard Sykin to an extent. I have read no shortage of poetry, of contemporary stuff. I think the untethered nature of poetry today is a lot to do with trying to be special. I really do. I'm going to move on. Next poem from Emily Dickinson here is a newer poem for me. Obviously, she didn't write this any more recently than the other stuff, but I'm seated. I've stopped being theirs. The name they dropped upon my face with water in the country church is finished using now. And they can put it with my dolls, my childhood, and my string of spools I've finished threading too. Baptized before without the choice, but this time consciously of grace unto supremest name, called to my full, the crescent dropped, existence's whole arc filled up with one small diadem. My second rank too small, the first, crowning on my father's breast a half unconscious queen, but this time adequate, erect, with will to choose or to reject, and I choose just a crown. I really like this poem. The reason I really like this poem is that this poem might be the most piss and vinegar of Emily Dickinson's entire treasure trove of poetry, at least to those poems that I've written. I'm seated. I've stopped being theirs. Wow. Starting a poem off with that. I'm seated. I've stopped being theirs. Powerful, powerful stuff. Down to, with will to choose or to reject, and I choose just a crown. I'm not what it is that you called me. I'm not who it was that you had known. I'm the queen, right? I'm not these things that you have decided. I am what I have decided, and I'm the best at it. I'm the best there is at what I do, and what I do isn't very nice, right? The Wolverine phrase. I referred earlier to Emily Dickinson as the nuclear option with poetry, at least for myself. If I need to reset myself, I'll sit down and read an Emily Dickinson poem, and it's done. I've nuked the whole day. Any of the little stuff that could have bothered me today. I read an Emily Dickinson poem, it's gone. Part of that is because of the chip on her shoulder. Part of that nuclear option is the fact that Emily Dickinson would have been familiar with the canon up to her point in poetry, would have known it. You can read her poetry and understand that she understood poetry. She didn't care. Didn't care. Would have read Shakespeare, didn't write sonnets. Right? Would have known about all of this wonderful, and again, pre-recorded music, prior to recorded music. Didn't care about predictability. Didn't care really about rhyme scheme. Didn't really care about rhyme. Definitely not rhyme scheme. She had these things to say and said them. Had these things to do and did them. This is Bukowski's The Loner that we read. That 16-inch neck. So he had the 16-inch neck. He had the windows boarded shut. Emily Dickinson kind of did that too. But he had kept up with the news, drank all the wine. Rough kind of guy. For Emily Dickinson, all of those things. The loner Emily Dickinson, all of those things were absorbed into writing poetry. All of those things. All the weird stuff that you can get into being a loner. And hey, here, you probably know someone who has lived alone. If you haven't yourself lived alone, probably you've lived alone at some point. Think back. That first year where you're really on your own, do you get more or less weird? You talk to yourself more. You sing to more songs than you ever did. Your bathing habits probably get less stringent. All of these things, you become weird. You become weirder the longer you live alone. That's just what happens. For Emily Dickinson, all of those trivialities, all of that nuance, all of those weird little things that you develop, all went into poetry. all went into distilling piss and vinegar. All went into thumbing a little bit more out of that chip on her shoulder. And ended up as words on page. Ended up as the most unapologetic writing you will ever read. Sylvia Plath doesn't really speak to me. There's a lot of digging I have to do in order to understand or appreciate a Sylvia Plath poem. It's not that way for everybody. A lot of people sit down with a Sylvia Plath poem and are immediately in love. Right there. Immediate. Boom. I understand this one. I don't know anybody who's that way with Emily Dickinson. I do not. And she never apologizes for it. Never. In fact, understood she wasn't the one who was wrong. Called publication the auction of the mind of man. The tenacity of this woman to write these words, and there's some confusing shit in Emily Dickinson, especially if you flip to the last few pages of this complete collection. And that's, you want to talk about, so the spiraling I talked about earlier. When you read Emily Dickinson, you can really sort of start to see it coming in. And then there's this golden era in the middle of this book where everything just hits so hard. And then we're spiraling in, but then poof, blow the whole thing out, because there's some crazy stuff herein. So this is the last video that I'm shooting chronologically for National Poetry Month. Somewhere along the way, in one of the William Blake videos that has come out or will come out, I made the comparison between reading Blake and reading the journal of like a school shooter, right? Sometimes there's just some weird stuff in there that you think, this guy was wacky. There's some stuff in Emily Dickinson's collection that you'll read and realize I have no idea what she's talking about, but I know she's smarter than me. I don't doubt her. Whatever this is, whatever this 4-line, our own possessions through our own, 'tis well to hoard anew, remembering the dimensions of possibility. I don't know, man. She's probably right, though. I have no idea what was said there. Let's just do it again. I'll stop at the first 4 lines. Okay, here's a 2-line poem. Poem 1707. Winter under cultivation is as arable as spring. I could spend 30 minutes with it and give you something, but... Poem 1662. He went by sleep that drowsy route to the surmising inn, at daybreak to begin his race, or ever to remain. I don't know, Emily. You win. You got it. You got it. Next poem. If you were coming in the fall, I'd brush the summer by with half a smile and half a spurn as housewives do a fly. If I could see you in a year, I'd wind the months in balls and put them each in separate drawers, for fear the numbers fuse. If only centuries delayed, I'd count them on my hand, subtracting till my fingers dropped into Van Diemen's land. If certainty when this life was out that yours and mine should be, I'd toss it yonder like a rind, and take eternity. But now, uncertain of the length of this that is between, it goads me like the goblin bee that will not state its sting. I remember when I found this poem 14 years ago. Just randomly reading Emily Dickinson, I found that poem. This was prior to the internet really being what the internet is, right? I'm talking like 2008. Yeah, there were websites. They were hard to get to, hard to find. Bookmarks were necessary because the centralization of the internet and Google, etc., were not there. What I'm meaning by that, yeah, probably somebody had a blog already talking about their favorite Emily Dickinson poems. But outside of things that you were assigned for class, poems like this, you couldn't find them. No one knew about them, except for individuals. Now, if I were to Google search Emily Dickinson's best poems, someone would have a top 5 list with this in it. More people would have a top 10 list with this poem in it. I had no idea this poem existed. But most people have an unrequited love. Most people have heartbreak. Most people have a friend who they think, how different would life be if instead of being friends, the two of us had been lovers? The two of us had fallen into each other's arms instead of slowly drifting apart. When you read this poem and you understand that dynamic, where you live in that dynamic, and you understand Emily Dickinson lived in that dynamic, it's a lot different, doesn't it? When you read this poem with the understanding that fall never comes, when you read this poem with the heart of an unrequited lover, when you read this poem through the lens of loneliness and disappointment, it's a much different poem. If you were coming in the fall, I'd brush the summer by with half a smile and half a spurn as housewives do a fly. If I could see you in a year, I'd widened the months in balls and put them each in separate drawers for fear the numbers fuse. If only centuries delayed, I'd count them on my hand, subtracting till my fingers dropped into Van Diemen's land. If certain when this life was out, that yours and mine should be? I toss it yonder like a rind and take eternity. But now, uncertain of the length of this that is between, it goads me like the goblin bee that will not state its sting. Reading this and understanding that the goblin bee does not sting. Man, it's rough. The next poem is the latest poem that I have to be added to my Emily Dickinson canon, the number of poems to which I will flip in order to reset the day. It is in the collected works number 532. I tried to think a lonelier thing. Now, I think this is going to be the first time I've ever read this out loud, so allow me to stutter. I tried to think a lonelier thing than any I had seen, some polar expiation, an omen of the bone, of death's tremendous nearness. I probed retrieveless things my duplicate to borrow, a haggard comfort springs from the belief that somewhere within the clutch of thought there dwells one other creature of heavenly love forgot. I plucked at our partition as one should pry the walls between himself and horror's twin with opposing cells. I almost strove to clasp his hand, such luxury it grew, that as myself could pity him, perhaps he pitied me. There's no phones in the world that Emily Dickinson inhabits. No telephones. No cell phones. And here she is. I tried to think a lonelier thing than any I had seen. I tried to think of someone lonelier than me. And feeling that loneliness, a psychic connection, I realized we're right back to back. And in this realization, as bad as I feel for him, maybe he pities me too. And that's a real connection. Now, I'm not trying to get weird and pretentious, but I am. I'm not trying to get weird and exclusive. I'm not trying to get weird and, anything. But odds are, if you're watching this, probably you're a writer as well. And this might not seem all that wild a prospect until you ask yourself what it takes to write this poem. Where do you get this idea? Where do you get this where do you get this question? Where do you get this conceit? Where does the mental horsepower come from in order to say, I tried to think a lonelier thing than any I had seen, some polar expiation, an omen in the bone of death's tremendous nearness. Talk all you want about the greatest of all time. Talk all you want. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Has nothing on this. The flea, the conceit in the flea, this sort of, look, This flea has sucked your blood and it sucked mine, and our bloods are mingling therein. Basically, we're already married, baby. We might as well. As comical as it is, that conceit has nothing on this. Where does this come from? Where do these ideas for Emily Dickinson come from? To unlock that mental potential, to take an idea like loneliness, which we're going to come back to, by the way, and say, in my loneliness, I'm here. In your loneliness, way out there. Really, because of loneliness, we're ass to ass. The only thing I can figure is that it began, this poem, with the conceit of emotions or feelings being a place. And if emotions and feelings are a place, what type of place would loneliness be? Well, loneliness as a place would have to be partitioned. Loneliness as a place would have to be a prison. And I think I'm not sure how personal I want to get. One of the breakups I've gone through in my life, one of the breakthroughs I've gone through, one of the breakups I've gone through in my life, significant other breakup, right? Was in a relationship with a woman who was a lot like me in her isolation. When she broke up with me, one of the things that devastated me the most not really for me. I've always been alone, right? Always been a loner. Can't really interact with other people very much, very often, for very long. Can't do it. Her and I were able to interact because we were that same way. The thing that crushed me most was imagining her no longer having that someone to talk to. Killed me. Still kills me. So the conceit in this poem, not the conceit, but here at the end, I almost strove to clasp his hand, such luxury. It grew that as myself could pity him, perhaps he pitied me. Being someone that was alone, the reason it crushed me to think of her alone is I understand that when the aloneness gets to be too much, it's totally overwhelming. I don't think that. So I talk about here all of the things that bring us together, right? All of the ubiquity that is in poetry, once that poetry becomes accessible to the reader. Poetry is not about how different we are, it's about how the same we are. It's about the sameness between us. That said, at the fringes of emotional reach, there are observations and there are realizations for what you've really got to be there, right? It's one thing to understand loneliness is painful. We all know loneliness is painful. That last stanza, I almost strove to clasp his hand. Such luxury. It grew that as myself could pity him, perhaps he pitied me. That's the same type of realization. The woman that I was dating when we split up, when she dumped me, really. Yeah, it sucked for me. I was sad for me. I'd put quite a bit into that. I had sacrificed quite a bit to try to be in a relationship. But as sad as I was for me, in my mind's eye, seeing her at the movies alone crushed me. That's a realization that I think you only get in those fringes of an emotion, in those extremities of a feeling. That's the work you really have to do your studies to know. And in that last stanza, as striking as the opening line is, and Emily Dickinson, I've said it before, I'll say it a million times. Emily Dickinson has some of the best opening lines, if not the best opening lines in poetry. I tried to think a lonelier thing. You've got no choice but to keep reading. That final stanza, woof. That's all I'll say. Moving on. The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease, and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea, for hold them blue to blue, the one the other will absorb as sponges buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God, for heft them pound for pound, and they will differ, if they do, as syllable from sound. One thing that I'm going to talk about a little bit with the next poem is the idea of biography within this collection of poetry. And the idea of biography within this collection of poetry is there because these poems are sort of assembled chronologically as best as their assemblers could understand. If, understanding that, we allow for this collection of poems to be the autobiography, not autobiographical, the autobiography of Emily Dickinson, this poem is perhaps the first time in the autobiography that she uses I, the letter I, to mean herself. This is Emily Dickinson recognizing Emily Dickinson. The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease, and you beside. Where the hell does she get these ideas? Holy moly. You know, the idea of ideas represented in Emily Dickinson as being this unrestrained, completely uninhibited reality. Is something that is hard to reconcile today. You know, it's easy to dismiss the idea of popular technology having an effect on the way that we conceive ideas, because for some of us, the technology has always been there. For some of us, the technology was never there until we were older. And I think, so I'm 36, I think my generation of people are the only ones that can fully grasp this, because our early life, we didn't have computers really. With the advent of computers, the idea of organizing ideas becomes very tangible, almost. You drag and drop these different ideas. You compartmentalize reality. For people my mother's age, for whom computers never really have factored into existence, compartmentalization of ideas is not as prevalent as it is in younger people. So I imagine the further back you go, the less connected the idea of ideas being organized really is. So back to Emily Dickinson here. The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease, and you beside. In order to conceptualize this, you have to have the idea of ideas taking space. For us today, it's fairly easy with icons on a computer, with thumbnails of your files, etc. Once you start putting ideas on paper, it becomes trivial to assume that idea has space. But then, once it's on paper, that idea is locked where it's at. It takes an awful lot of ideas on paper for the brain to be deeper than the sea, and hold them blue to blue, the one the other will absorb as sponges buckets do. So Emily Dickinson, taking the idea of ideas as physical space, and then as weight. It used to be, if you wanted to find a quote, for example, I have an encyclopedia of dictionaries. In that encyclopedia of dictionaries, it has a dictionary of quotes. You used to have to know who said it, or the topic, or etc., about it in order to reference it. When I was younger, this was the case. Now, all I've got to do is pull out my cell phone, pull up Google, and sort of get the quote almost right. And I can see who said it. I can find the exact quote. I can find where it was requoted. I can find out what it technically means. All of these different things. Didn't used to be the case. Prior to really the ubiquity of computers, intelligence was a totally different thing. To quote someone, you had to have it. You weren't going to be able to find it. I mean, think about, for anyone around my age, you used to have to call the radio station to figure out, I really like that song I heard on the way home from work today. You couldn't Google the lyrics. You would call in and there would be someone there to listen to you. The whole world has changed with the advent and ubiquity of computers and Google, etc. When you recognize the differences between ages, not I'm 36, you're 32, but epochs. Again, like with emotions and the fringes of emotions. The fringes of intelligence is one of the greatest places to find those things. Oh no. There was a philosopher, I can't remember who it was, 1700s-ish, who they say was the last man to know everything there was to know. Everything we knew, that guy knew it. Nobody's doing that today. The smartest people on earth are specialized. And that's smart, right? Not intelligent, smart. Know a thing to its extent. The most intelligent people, when you're talking about the Elon Musks of the world, they are able to, so the difference between intelligence and smarts. Smarts are knowledge. Intelligence is ability. If you took all of Elon Musk's companies away from him, he would re-become a billionaire. He's a very intelligent person, can take something and learn it for himself and push past the limits of what is known. So much of that used to have to be memorized. I have never seen a more beautiful encapsulation of the idea of transcendent intelligence than this poem from Emily Dickinson. The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease, and you beside. Poem 777. We're going to get back to the idea of these poems as autobiography. The loneliness one dare not sound, and would as soon surmise, as in its grave go plumbing to ascertain the size. The loneliness whose worst alarm is lest itself should see, and perish from before itself for just a scrutiny. The horror, not to be surveyed, but skirted in the dark, with consciousness suspended and being under lock. I fear me this is loneliness, the maker of the soul, its caverns and its corridors illuminate or seal. When allowing for Emily Dickinson's poems to be understood as autobiography, we understand that this exploration of loneliness, as it means the exploration of loneliness as it means not just isolation, but perhaps terminality, is stark and stunning. And when you realize, again, compiled more or less chronologically, we have the poet here struggling with the idea of loneliness. Emily Dickinson was a very isolated individual, struggling with the idea of loneliness as loneliness translates to death. Emily Dickinson was a very isolated individual, struggling with the idea of loneliness as loneliness translates to death and can translate to death by one's own hand. Emily Dickinson was a very isolated individual. On the kissing page to this, poem 774, is it a lonesome glee, yet sanctifies the mind with fair association afar upon the wind? A bird to overhear delight without a cause, a restless as invisible, a matter of the skies. Prior to this, she's already still playing with the idea of loneliness. One page before that. Now remember, she's eventually settling, after this, she's going to settle on the theme of loneliness. Loneliness. The hallowing pain, like hallowing of heaven, obtains at corporeal cost. The summit is not given to him the summit is not given to him who strives severe at middle of the hill, but he who has achieved the top. All is the price of all. So I mentioned this idea of Emily Dickinson being read as autobiography, Emily Dickinson's struggles. We have to then observe an individual who is changing. I mentioned before also that spiral out of control that is evident within Emily Dickinson. I want to leave you with this. Poem 1334. And boy, we had some fun, didn't we? We're going to leave you on a real zinger here. A real pick-me-up. That's what you've come to expect here, right? How soft this prison is. How sweet these sullen bars. No despot but the king of down invented this repose. Of fate, if this is all, he has no added realm. A dungeon but a kinsman is incarceration. Home. Is that Peter Gabriel song, My Body is a Cage? How soft this prison is. I think that the immediate response to that opening line is wondering if the individual is imprisoned in their body. I think to someone like Emily Dickinson, who is so synonymous with ideas, yeah, I think that's going to be part of the case here. incarceration, home. This is also an individual whose experiences with the world were increasingly sort of relegated to the room in which she lived. Going back to that duality of poetry that we talked about earlier. The prison that our speaker is invoking, I think, happens to be both the body and the home. And this seems to be a meditation on the body becoming one with the home, and the home becoming one with the body. Emily Dickinson, man. Emily Dickinson. That is all I have for this, the 100th poetry discussion. Boy, we had some fun. I feel like we really know each other better. I feel like we really got ahead in our relationship. Now go away.